Yeah, hi everybody. As Pat just explained, I started a new role at ThoughtWorks where I work about 5 months ago, and it's a full-time role to explore and kind of cross-pollinate in the company as well, anything related with using generative AI in the software delivery process and actually beyond coding. And so I want to give you today a little bit of a reality check as much as I can in 25 minutes and share with you a little bit what I learned over the past 5 months. And as you're probably aware, so this is the Gartner hype cycle, and generative AI is, of course, on top of the peak of inflated expectations. And they also have something else there that they call AI augmented software engineering. And this is actually Gartner and other analysts and, you know, the McKinseys of the world. They're all, when they do publishing their analyses about which domains, which areas will be the most impacted by this new flavor of AI, software engineering is always on top of that pile. And, you know, I think you're all in the audience somewhere on a scale between these two extremes, right? Like of either being super excited about this and thinking, you know, in 2 years we're not writing code anymore, or, you know, on the other extreme of the scale, being super skeptical and saying this is not going to do anything, right? I'm certainly somewhere in between, and so I'm going to try and get those of you who are very excited a little bit more down to earth, and those of you who are very skeptical a little more excited, and hopefully I'll succeed in that. Let's see. And I'll start with talking about what's new here or what's different, especially in the coding assistance. This is basically code generation, right? And at the beginning of my career, I was actually working in a lot of teams that were using model-driven development, and I was working on teams that were building code generators. So when this coding assistance with GenAI idea came along, I was kind of trying to compare what's actually different here, because I'm not doing that model-driven development anymore, and there's reasons for that. So what we've always tried in software engineering is to raise the level of abstraction, right? Remove the amount of details that as a developer I have to deal with. And we've done that in different ways, right? There's programming languages, and then we have the machine fill in the details for us through a compiler. There's what I just gave as an example, models or domain-specific languages, and we have a code generator that fills in the details. Frameworks like Spring fill in the details for us, right? And then low-code applications, of course, as well. So we're raising the level of abstraction. But as always in engineering, there's a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is customizability and extensibility. So there's kind of this force field or glass ceiling that we just cannot smash with raising the abstraction level, because at some point, you know, we might get into a situation where we just need more control, and the high level of abstraction of a low-code platform maybe doesn't give that enough to us in our particular case. So is this, you know, this GenAI assisted coding, is that just yet another try to raise that abstraction level to natural language, just in a non-deterministic and non-repeatable, slightly more shitty way? I actually don't think so. I think it's more of a lateral move. So it's, you know, this new tool for us to assist us. So these arrows here are on purpose dashed or dotted, right? So it's assisting us to create artifacts on all levels of abstractions. And it's actually doing that in a more ad hoc, unstructured way. So we don't have to define formal code generators and like compilers and put a lot of work into that. And it's also slightly closer to our human thinking, the way we can express that, right? And actually, like some of the most powerful demos that are out there are in the area of creating applications, of creating low-code applications, right? Where you write a paragraph of natural language and it gives you like this whole application, and that is possible because it's kind of set at that low-code level, right? So, but you're still going to have the same constraints that you have with the low-code application. So then the question is, how do we use all of this to our advantage in software engineering? And in particular, I'll be using examples here of a large language model. So to be more specific about what area of GenAI we're talking about here. And, you know, there's lots of things we could look at. I have, as I said, a limited amount of time. So I'll talk a bit about coding, documentation, and story writing, and then have a bit of a conclusion about how to think about this in terms of impact on the team. So I'll start with coding assistance, of course, as that is one of the key areas, and maybe also if any of you are already using GenAI on your software teams, this is probably the one that you started with. And so there are these coding assistance products, and GitHub Copilot is arguably the leader of the pack there at the moment, but there's lots of other ones popping up. And the two core features are usually this kind of inline assistance, so you're typing in your editor and you're kind of getting autocomplete on steroids. And then most of them also have a chatbot integrated. This is actually a screenshot of ChatGPT, but all of these assistants also have chatbots integrated into the IDE, and then you have the added advantage of the chatbot having a bit of context of your open files as well. So you have like an additional kind of integration in your user experience. But there's lots of other features that are popping up, and lots of companies exploring how to leverage this further beyond those two things of inline assistance and chatbot. So here at the top, I have this example of generating tests, for example, right? So you can do that as a developer by just asking Copilot Chat, for example, to generate test scenarios or tests for you. But there are also some companies who are trying to focus on that and specifically provide you with tools to help you think about your test scenarios and generate tests. There's self-hosting options. There's open source tools where you can bring your own model key. There's some interesting ideas about debugging. Like I've seen some interesting ones that didn't quite work for me yet, but the ideas looked really promising. There's vulnerability scanning. There's other forms of user experience like a chat workflow from the terminal. So there's lots of stuff. And I'm actually quite excited about this. Like, I love using these tools with all the constraints that they still have. Some of them will get better. Some of them will not get better. So I love using them. And also, so we are using GitHub Copilot specifically at about 40 clients at ThoughtWorks now, and also our internal surveys about just how useful is this to you, what's the experience like, are all quite positive, and the Net Promoter Score is over 30, which is quite good. And I still have open questions and concerns how it will impact us as a profession, right? So what will it do to learning in particular? And, you know, as a result to our design and architecture skills. But I just, you know, as a user, when I code, I just cannot resist this type of support that it gives me. And I'm already at the point where I don't want to miss it anymore, to be honest. But I was already mentioning this is non-deterministic. You know, and so it's not always great. And the one thing we have to learn when we start using these tools is to see when it's useful and when it's not. And then, you know, it depends when it's useful. So what does it depend on? So one thing is the experience of the developer. So I've been programming for more than 20 years. So I usually know what I want to do, and I know what I ask for. So, and then these tools are just helping me with the details. So that's quite powerful for me. But on the other hand, sometimes I get tired of all the code review. I know some colleagues of mine who sometimes switch them off because they, you know, they know what they want to do and they just want to write it. They're, you know, maybe fatigued by all of the review. And then on the other hand, you have less experienced or more junior developers who maybe get a big boost on the plus side in learning with this new access to information, but on the other hand might get led down the wrong path more often and kind of like get into a rabbit hole because they don't understand as much what is being suggested. Prevalence of the tech stack, of course, makes a difference, like how prevalent is the tech stack in the training data. The type of the problem makes a difference, like how straightforward, how common is it, how boilerplate is it, how complex is it, isolation and size of the problem. So if you need to call a lot of other parts of your code base, then, you know, it might not be quite as useful. You should think about your tolerance for errors for the particular thing you're working on, like how much you trust the suggestions you're getting. And your existing code base can actually also have an impact because tools like Copilot, they try to pick snippets from around where you're working and the files that you have open, and they just repeat them. They don't know what's good code, what's bad code, right? So they might just like amplify parts of your code base that you might not want amplified. So this is not reliable, not predictable, and I really like this article where the title is AI is not good software, it is pretty good people, and it's So the author is basically saying AI is terrible software in the sense that it's not like other software we're using, and we have to embrace that when we think about the use cases that we're using it for. So, you know, and I think it's like not understanding this maybe, or not embracing this is one of the reasons that sometimes developers put Copilot aside after the first day of using it, because they're like, oh, this is actually not helping me, you know. But sometimes, you know, if it's helping you 60% of the way or 70% of the way or in 50% of your tasks, is better than zero, right? So that's kind of this mindset shift here. And sometimes to also just leave it aside and not use it for something. And I want to give one more example from the coding space, or from where a large language model can help us translate natural language to some form of code. And that's the area of translating natural language into queries. So here's an example from kind of the observability monitoring space. This is Google Cloud's Duet AI, helping a user write a Prometheus query for their metrics. And this is also relevant for the log space, right? Exploring logs. I don't know how many of you have fiddled with queries to find the right logs while you were debugging, right? So this can potentially be quite helpful. Here's another example from Honeycomb, an observability tool, who also already months ago built a feature like this in, where you can use natural language to try and query your system data. And you can also imagine using this for your own databases, right? So here's an example of a schema here on the top left-hand side, and then you ask a question in natural language, and it translates it into an SQL query and also executes the query for you. So you can imagine this for onboarding purposes, right? When somebody comes into the team and doesn't know the schema that well yet, and it's actually helping you understand the queries a bit more. This is a very simple schema, of course, but there was an interesting article recently by Snowflake, who were writing about how they're currently trying to train a model specifically for this for this query generation task, so that it also works with larger and messier schemas. So next I want to talk a bit about documentation, because it's being mentioned a lot. Like, I hear that a lot in talks, like, oh, your developers now don't have to write documentation anymore. GenAI can just generate it for you, right? And one of the reasons why I'm not so excited about this, it just generates documentation for you part, is that I worry about losing the journey for certain types of documentation, at least. Actually, the first time I spoke at the LeadDev conference, I talked about documentation and the purposes of documentation. And one of the things I brought up was to use it to surface and understand complexity, and actually also problem solving. Because while I'm writing documentation or decision records, I'm thinking through what I did, right? Or I'm discovering sometimes, oh, this is actually quite hard to explain. Is there maybe something about the solution that we should change, something we should simplify? So I worry about that for some types of documentation. Because sometimes the journey is the destination, not the artifact. And with GenAI, lots of people seem to be focused on creating artifacts quicker and kind of skipping some of the things that are actually valuable for us. Having said that, of course, large language models are good at helping us with writing or also summarizing and clustering information, right? This is ChatGPT summarizing 190 commit messages for me and actually clustering them in quite a nice way. So this result, actually 90% made sense, right? You can imagine using this to create the start of a change log, or maybe when somebody was out for a while, they don't sift through all the commit messages, but maybe you have this generation. Given the commit messages actually have the information in them, right? Of course. Data quality still matters. But there are some interesting new twists here also for the users of information, not just for the creators of documentation. So there's these new ways now to discover documentation, right? Some of you, maybe you've looked into the space, you know, you've heard of retrieval augmented generation and these kind of like new ways to access information. And I mean, the chatbots I mentioned before are a great example. I now, because I'm like venturing in this data space, have to write more Python code, which I have never really done much in my life. So I'm just asking it very, very basic questions like, are there static functions in Python? And I'm quite confident about the answer because it's pretty basic, right? But it saves me so much time and leaves me in my flow so much when I'm in the IDE. And there's also tools, like here's an example, a tool called Cursor, who have started integrating this with docs as well, right? So here I'm asking it a question, and beforehand I'm telling it, you know, also take into account the playwright reference documentation. And then they kind of index that locally for me and try to take that into account. The other angle here for users of documentation is that it's almost like a potential way to create on-the-fly documentation for our existing code base, and we don't have to persist it. It's kind of ephemeral, which means we also don't have to update it, which is like a big pain point about documentation, right? So here's an example of like this idea of an ask the code base feature, which a lot of coding assistant products are now working on integrating as well. So I'm asking here, where am I calculating the gender distribution? This is a little code base to create chat participation statistics. And you can see here, it's actually searching through and reading my spec files in the code base. And then also at the very bottom, it's a little small down there, but it's linking me to lines of code in my specs where I assert my results about gender distribution. And the reason why it's doing that is that it's actually not only using a large language model. So when you're maybe one of the skeptics in the audience and you're thinking about the constraints and weaknesses of large language models, you should also keep in mind that a lot of these tools are combining them with other tools, right? So what I just showed was a tool called Bloop, and there's also a company called SourceGraph that maybe some of you might know because they've been around for a while. They have this code search and mass refactoring product, and they're also now combining that with a large language model. So it's basically a combination with something that does understand the syntax of the code and how it all fits together, whereas the language model only understands the tokens, right? So that's an additional way to unlock some of this potential. But as I just mentioned, data quality still matters, right? In this case, the data is the code, right? So if you have like a really messy old code base with not very expressive variable and function names, and that's not very readable to a human, a language model might also not be able to do anything with it because there's no information in that code, right? And also with discovering other information in your wiki or something, if the wiki is very messy and has like lots of outdated and contradictory information, a language model will also not magically help you answer all your questions. So my final example is about writing user stories. And so I have a little example here that I'm going to play, where at the bottom left, I know it's not very readable in the back, but don't worry. So at the bottom left is basically preloaded, like a business context or just a basic description of what the team is even working on. That's going to be included in all of the prompts. So this would have been written by a domain expert on the team. And now somebody who's writing a story is entering a high-level description of that story at the top. And now the AI is actually starting to ask questions. So not I'm asking the AI, but the other way around. And it would ask me things like, what details have to be provided? Can you create 2 of these entries on the same date? Can you do this in the past? What happens if you don't fill out this field? And at the end, it actually generates a starting point, like given when then scenarios of a story for you. And I can continue the chat conversation here, actually, and ask it more questions. And it, in this case, it even also reminded me of the cross-function requirement of this application needs to work offline. So because that was included in the business context, so I could ask it to generate more scenarios for me. So this can potentially help us find gaps in our thinking earlier, shift left in the process, right? And if we improve that quality, we might reduce some waste later on. Or, you know, you could be running this in an estimation session or something just to see, you know, did we forget about anything? And, you know, then maybe as the person writing the story, I get these questions earlier, not just in the estimation session or a story kickoff when I sit with the developers later. And it will never write the full story for you. You still have to sanity check all recommendations. So this is another example of how this is assisting us, right? It's not getting us all the way there. So that shouldn't be the expectation of this. But we should look for ways how it can augment and assist us in what we're doing. And so I really like this idea of using language models for brainstorming, also for other areas. You can use this to maybe ask it questions about your architecture, describe your architecture. And I mean, we all know there's so many trade-offs, and context matters so much in architecture. So I'm pretty sure most of the time it won't give us the perfect answers. But of the 5 things it points out, maybe one of them we hadn't thought about yet, right? The others we dismiss, but maybe one we hadn't thought about yet. So as this is a conference for engineering leaders, I gave some practical examples, but of course, the question on everybody's mind is how can this actually impact delivery performance overall of the teams? And so to just think about coding assistance, coding is less than 40% of what a team spends time on, right? Like that at least tracks with my experience. And here's also an example from one of GitHub's developer surveys, where they asked teams what they spent most of their time doing, and they said here writing code is 32%. So if you use a coding assistant, remember that coding is just part of what the team is doing, right? And also, GitHub's numbers are kind of being misinterpreted and pulled out of context by some people, right? So they have this one number that gets quoted a lot about 55% faster task completion. And it seems like some people, maybe also people a little bit further away from software delivery, are taking this as, I can now cut teams in half. And I'm not even joking, that's like an actual thing that I've also seen at one of our clients. But this is, of course, about task completion, right? They're not saying that, you know, the whole team is going to get 55% faster. So if we do like a little bit of a heuristic about the impact on cycle time, because everybody's fixated on time and speed here again, right? In a very optimistic scenario, let's say you spend 40% of your cycle time on coding. The coding that is supportable by an assistant is maybe 60%, and you can actually complete your task 55% faster. Then your time saved, and my head hurt a little bit when I did this percentage math, but the time saved in cycle time, just in cycle time, so from start of development to done, would be 13%. And I put a Jira control chart here at the bottom to remind everybody how variable cycle time is, right? So 10% or something, you might not even see it, depending on how variable it is. But that doesn't mean that the coding assistant is not helping. And actually, just to give an example, GitHub's Copilot will probably cost you less than 0.1 of a percentage point of your cost of the overall team, so in comparison to that. So you have to look beyond speed metrics. So developer flow and experience do matter, right? And that's definitely one thing where there's very clear signs that it does improve the developer experience, and developers are quite happy with this. But also look at stuff like test coverage, for example. We've seen teams where with developers who did not like writing tests, or maybe also had never done TDD before, and suddenly there's this AI generating code for them, and they're like, oh, I didn't write this. I don't know if this works. What do I do? And they start writing tests. And, you know, that might actually increase your test coverage overall. And again, you're using the time you're saving for something else. Also look at stuff like onboarding time and general staff mobility. How much easier is it for people to discover other code bases, understand what's going on, and to discover information? But also, of course, you have to monitor other things to look for bad consequences of using this, right? Like what is happening to your extensibility and maintainability over time. And you might be able to look at stuff like debugging time for that, right? Like now that people don't write all of the code and maybe have less ownership of it, is there something happening to incident response time, debugging time, stuff like that? And also I gave an example of story writing. So if you want to like increase that, you know, very positive scenario of 13%, look at maybe other ways to use generative AI, like further left in the process to reduce waste later. And finally, remember that this is a whole system, a collaborative system, right? So I try to kind of visualize here, if you just increase the coding throughput, right, in the middle there, what happens to the other parts of your process? If you can code faster, can you also fill the backlog faster? Can you ship faster? More lines of code means more problems, right? Means more tech debt. Can you deal with that if there's more throughput of that? So you have to look at it still at an overall system. So if you are super excited about this, I just want to remind you that data quality still matters. I gave a few examples of that. Sometimes the journey is the destination. So just because we now see all of these ways to create all of these artifacts, we still need to kind of know what's in them. We need to own them. We need to process what's going on. And we have to keep the whole system and the users in mind. And if you are more skeptical, think about the potential of combining language models with other tools. There is lots of room for improvements actually in these technologies. I don't think it's like in some of the other hypes. I don't want to name names of other recent hypes. And it's about more than coding. So look at other tasks as well. And this point about AI is not good software, that is actually for me like a message for both the excited people and the skeptics. Because even if you're a skeptic, the fact that this is not like other software doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. You should just approach it differently. So there's some more writing about this here that I can share with you, and also ThoughtWorks has a booth, so come chat, and we have a little demo to play with as well, and I have a bunch of coding assistants installed on my laptop if you want to play around with some of them. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.